Good evening. My name is Trish Fauché, and I'm president of the Institute for Financial Markets. And I'm delighted to welcome each of you to our Smart Financial Regulation Roundtable and our opening dinner. It's an exciting time for the Institute for Financial Markets as we continue to adapt in the way and the format in which we deliver information about the markets. We're delighted to co-host this event with the Financial Markets Working Group of the Mercatus Center of George Mason University, a university-based research center for market-oriented ideas. As a nonprofit educational foundation, the IFM seeks to increase the public awareness and understanding of the importance of financial markets to the global economy. Our mission aligns well with that of the Mercatus Financial Working Group, which seeks to explore how financial markets foster economic growth and prosperity and the role that the well-designed regulation plays in these markets. It's through this synergy that we bring you the Smart Financial Regulation Roundtable. In co-hosting this event, we both hope to foster a robust dialogue among academics, market practitioners, and regulators about smart ideas that could make a difference in improving the regulation of markets. In addition to working with the Mercatus Center, we also sought to partner with others. 2 weeks ago, we announced that the Institute, along with the FIA, the Global Trade Organization for the Futures, Options, and Centrally Cleared Derivatives Markets, the National Futures Association, the self-regulatory organization for our industry, as well as the CME Group and CME Foundation, have joined forces to launch a free online educational resource about the markets called futuresfundamentals.org. This website provides interactive tools, a trading simulator, as well as a curriculum for learners of all ages who wish to understand the role of the derivatives markets play in the global economy and our everyday lives. It's a terrific educational resource for market users, policymakers, educators, and students, as well as the general public. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ben Klutzy, of the Program Manager for the Financial Markets Working Group and the Program on Monetary Policy at the Mercatus Center. Again, we're delighted that you're here with us this evening.
Thank you very much, President Fauché. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ben Klutzy, Program Manager of the Financial Markets Working Group at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Along with our friends at the IFM, we'd like to welcome you all to our discussions on smart financial regulation. The Mercatus Center at George Mason University is a university-based research center. Our goal is to be a bridge between the world of academia and the world of public policy. So basically, we like to take academic research and find ways in which they apply to real-world public policy problems. We've been a premier source of market-based ideas for about 4 decades now, and we get really excited about how markets work and how they solve problems. As you know, markets are dynamic, markets are constantly changing, and markets are constantly evolving. So from time to time, we have to step back and figure out if our regulations are smart enough to allow markets to thrive, to be dynamic, to be robust, and to fuel our great economy. Which is why we're here this evening and we'll be here tomorrow. We have assembled a group of academics, regulators, practitioners, smart people to help us figure out ways in which our regulations can be smarter. Which brings me to tonight's keynote speaker. He recently joined the Commodity Futures Trading Commission as a commissioner. He came to the role with extensive experience in public policy and as a practitioner in the industry. He started out on Capitol Hill and he became a senior policy advisor. He started out in finance at the Hale Townsend, where he performed valuation analysis on regional and global banks. As an entrepreneur, he started his own firm, Seculum Capital Management, before he joined the CFTC. At the CFTC, he has already sponsored 2 advisory committees, the Technology Advisory Committee, the Global Markets Advisory Committee. He is focused on issues like cybersecurity, fintech, and many interesting areas. In his prior speeches, he has declared that the source code provision of the CFTC's proposed regulation on automated trading is DEAD, dead, and call the supplementary leverage ratio a horror show. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you're going to be in for a treat. He won't be able to take questions after we're done, but I trust that he's going to give us enough to mull over tonight and throughout the day tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Commissioner Brian Quintanz.
Thank you, Ben, for that very, very kind introduction. It's really wonderful to be here with you. A big thank you to Mercatus and to IFM for hosting this great conference. And I just want to acknowledge that. I think, for those of us that really care about free and competitive markets and smart regulation, how lucky we are to have someone who is as dedicated to trying to serve in a public capacity as Mercatus' own Hester Peirce. Hester is going to make a stellar commissioner over at the SEC, and as one of the few people that has had a longer and more arduous process to get to that goal than I did. Hester, I want to thank you for your dedication and your patience. I really look forward to working with you. Before I begin, I have to say that my comments reflect my own views and not those of the Commission or my children or my pets or anything like that. Speaking of my kids, I kind of wanted to start tonight by talking about something that I reflected on recently when I was reading this story to them. I have two children. I have a 10-year-old son and I have an 8-year-old daughter. And when they were younger, I would read them stories from the Frog and Toad books. I don't know if anyone remembers the Frog and Toad stories or not. Yeah? Okay. Out of a bit of nostalgia, we decided to read one of those more recently, even though they're a little bit too old for it. And I wanted to share it with you. I wasn't going to read it because I might actually devolve into using the character voices that I do with my kids. So I'm just going to explain it to you. It's called The List. And so Toad wakes up one day and he gets out of bed and gets dressed and he has breakfast. And he creates a list of things that he wants to do. So he writes down on his list, wake up, get dressed, eat breakfast, go to Frog's house, take a walk with Frog, have lunch, come home, clean up, go to bed. So he crosses off, wake up, get dressed, have breakfast, and next thing on his list is to go to Frog's house. So he goes over to Frog's house and he knocks on the door and he says, Frog, I have a list of things to do, and my list tells me that we're going to take a walk. Frog says, okay, I'm ready, let's go. So they go and they take a walk, and a big gust of wind comes up and it blows the list out of Toad's hands. And Frog says, hurry, we have to go get it. And Toad says, no, I can't. And Frog says, well, why not? And he says, because it's not on my list of things to do. And I was reading the story and I said, oh my gosh, Toad must have been in charge of the CFTC for the last 8 years. Because of all the logical reforms which the CFTC could have done, could have accomplished, could have used to implement the mandates of Dodd-Frank, of all the ways they could have designed regulations or rules in a simple or straightforward manner, those weren't on their list of things to do. In my mind, the CFTC rushed to finalize and implement rules, sometimes forsaking the objectives that well-crafted rules could have addressed. I'm going to take a different approach during my tenure. I'm going to advocate that the CFTC takes a different approach. I have been consistent and I've been clear that my priority as a commissioner is to ensure that the CFTC focuses on risk by identifying risk appropriately and targeting that risk specifically. When I think of smart regulation prioritizes a thoughtful analysis of policy goals, of regulatory costs, properly calibrated thresholds, and corresponding impacts on incentives. And in fact, a goal-oriented or risk-mitigating public policy often involves formulating a threshold. If a threshold is met, then a certain population is assigned to bear the obligations or the regulations that are necessary to affect that stated goal or to mitigate the targeted risk. For example, to ring-fence risk, regulators must, number one, understand, assess, and specify risks, determine if a regulatory solution is needed, calibrate the regulations, costs, or obligations to target those risks, and lastly, identify the types of entities potentially responsible for those lists and that can appropriately bear those obligations or those costs. To effectively implement that, regulators must create a threshold or a metric to capture a narrowly defined population exclusively. This helps to ensure that a regulatory burden is not imposed on a broader population. Trouble occurs when there's an imbalance, such as when a threshold captures a broader population that is unassociated with the risk or that is unable to bear the cost of the regulations or both. If regulations are too broad, if they capture entities that pose a little risk but regulate them like high-risk entities, those regulations treat low-risk activity and high-risk activity identically. And when that happens, low-risk activity is penalized. Frequently, any imbalance between a regulation's stated purpose and its final outcome results from a one-size-fits-all policy approach to applying thresholds. The current de minimis threshold for swap dealer registration is Exhibit A in the prior CFTC's leadership's one-size-fits-all philosophy. It imposes broad costs and regulatory burdens on generic activity without regard for achieving stated policy goals or mitigating identified risks. In its current form, the de minimis exception policy does not serve the end users for whom these marketplaces were designed or meant to benefit. In fact, it acts in direct opposition to their interests and well-being. But first, let me give you a little bit of background on this. If you're not familiar with the issue, Title VII of Dodd-Frank enacted a number of reforms that targeted the swaps market. One of the most significant provisions calls for the registration of swap dealing entities. Once an entity is designated as a swap dealer, it becomes subject to the extensive costs of swap dealer regulations. Recognizing that not all swap dealing activity warranted extensive regulation, Congress crafted an exemption to that, excluding entities with a de minimis level of dealing activity. So in 2012, the CFTC issued a final rule that defined when an entity must register as a swap dealer and further defined the de minimis exception. The final rule established a 5-year phase-in period during which the de minimis threshold was set at $8 billion or less in gross notional value of swap dealing activity measured over the prior 12 months. At the end of that phase-in period, the de minimis threshold automatically decreased to $3 billion in notional activity, unless the CFTC took prior action. The CFTC has now twice delayed that reduction, most recently last week, and for very good reason. Notional value thresholds of $8 billion or $3 billion neither mitigate systemic risk nor justify the costs of swap dealer regulation. Some people have described the current de minimis threshold of $8 billion as a loophole. In my mind, that threshold's reduction to $3 billion would create a black hole that would suck in community banks and end users who pose zero systemic risk. At the center of that black hole lies an enormous set of costs. There's up to a $1 million membership fee at the NFA. There's $20 to $100 million in minimum capital requirements, costs for clearing and margin, IT costs for trade processing, confirmation, and reconciliation activities, costs to create and send to clients daily valuation reports, third-party audit expenses, legal fees to develop and implement business conduct rules, and many more. If that sounds like a big bill, you're right. Our own former acting chairman, Sharon Brown-Ruska, through NARA, estimated that the costs to register as a swap dealer are $390 million per firm. So I don't think a lot of people want to sign up for that, because obviously small banks and businesses can't withstand those costs. Compared to those costs, the revenue from $3 to $8 billion of swap dealing activity is immaterial. Swap transactions are not a major source of revenue, and in fact, the fees usually only cover the cost of the service. and yet a firm's single alternative to registration is to limit client-driven activity or risk hedging swap transactions in order to avoid exceeding the de minimis threshold, but in doing so, losing business to larger competitors. The government is putting these smaller client-serving institutions between Scylla and Charybdis, for those of you Odyssey fans. Choose between saving your business or serving your clients. So why have we found ourselves in this dilemma? Put simply, a poorly conceived public policy threshold that has burdened too many market participants with costs that are disproportionate to the risks they pose or the possible benefits of their registration. So what were the benefits supposed to be of swap dealer registration? Well, Dodd-Frank advanced three main policy objectives: systemic risk reduction, counterparty protection, and market integrity through enhanced swap market transparency and efficiency. When the de minimis threshold was finalized, the CFTC provided no evidence that either an $8 billion or a $3 billion notional value threshold would advance those policy objectives. In fact, it would have been hard for them to do that, considering, in Chairman Massad's words, it was done without the benefit of any data. So now we have a chance to correct this error. And in doing so, I believe the Commission must better align the criteria for the de minimis threshold with the costs of swap dealer registration, specifically the largest cost targeting systemic risk. It's my hope that with the benefit of updated and improved data, as well as 5 years of swap dealer regulatory experience, this can be accomplished quickly and we can get away from using notional value. Notional value's deficiencies as a metric make any registration threshold that is based solely upon it unlikely to advance the policy goals of swap dealer regulation. Notional value is an incredibly poor measure of activity and it is a meaningless measure of risk. In fact, $8 billion in notional values of swaps can represent a very small amount of risk. In fact, in some cases, almost none, which is exactly why smaller banks and businesses might easily exceed a $3 billion or an $8 billion threshold. So to demonstrate that, we're going to actually walk through a couple examples of an interest rate swap. I know you're really excited to do that. Some people in this room may be very familiar with interest rate swaps, and I'm going to take some liberties here. So if you need to take some deep breaths or walk out of the room, I understand. But we're going to do this for the people that have never conceptualized this before. And notional value figures get thrown around this town all the time by people that don't understand them. So let's have a goal of walking out of this room tonight understanding what notional value actually means. So in an interest rate swap, you have two sides. You have a side that pays the market floating rate, and you have a side that pays a predetermined fixed rate. So if, all things being equal, if the market rate moves higher, the party paying that floating rate, quote unquote, loses or faces a loss. Let's say we have two parties, Party A and Bank X. Party A wants to enter into a $100 million one-year interest rate swap with Bank X. And Bank X is going to take the floating side of that. So let's assume that right after that happens, interest rates rise by 1% immediately after they enter into that contract and then don't move again. Right? What's Bank X's loss? What could Bank X's loss be generally? Well, in this case, it's only that 1% in extra interest that it would owe to Party A over that 1 year, which is $1 million, a far cry from a very large and scary sounding $100 million notional figure. It's even more severe if we diminish the time that that swap exists, if we shorten its tenor. So for instance, I know there aren't 1 week interest rate swaps, but we're going to pretend that there are. There are 3-month fixed rate agreements, and there are actually very short duration equity swaps and foreign exchange swaps, but we're going to go into a 1 week interest rate swap. So if the same exact thing happened for 1 week, then the loss for a 1% interest rate move to Bank X would be the additional interest that it would owe over that 1 week. Not over the whole year, just that 1 week. So about $19,000. So we have two different swaps, each at $100 million notional value. One has a loss of about $1 million, one has a loss of about 19,000. What if Bank X has two offsetting swaps, a long and a short? In that case, its market risk is almost zero, but from a de minimis perspective, in terms of calculating notional value, its risk has doubled. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So it should be apparent, hopefully, that notional value on its own isn't a great measure of activity and is a meaningless measure of risk. Certainly an $8 billion notional threshold and a $3 billion threshold could capture firms that pose no systemic risk to the market and whose client-driven activity constitutes a very small percentage of the overall market. If firms don't pose systemic risk, it's hard to argue that they should be captured as swap dealers and subject to the same immense costs as the world's largest, most interconnected financial institutions. Smaller entities may exceed a notional threshold, but have a relatively minor footprint in the marketplace. Their registration would not meaningfully advance the goals of customer protection and market transparency, but it would saddle them with the same significant costs. In fact, in the past, the Commission has actually agreed in principle with using a metric that would exclude activity that was sufficiently modest in light of the total size, concentration, and other attributes of the applicable markets, and that, quote, the imposition of regulatory burdens on such entities would not be expected to contribute significantly to advancing the customer protection, market efficiency, and transparency objectives of dealer regulation, end quote. And systemic risk posed by non-registered banks is already limited. Every bank's derivative activities, whether it is registered as a swap dealer or not, are already heavily scrutinized during regular exams by federal bank regulators and publicly disclosed on quarterly federal call reports. What's more, there are currently 102 registered swap dealers. 51 of those are actually lead regulated by the Federal Reserve. Where is the gaping hole in systemic risk that an overly strict swap dealer registration threshold would plug or a more flexible standard would expose? I don't see one. A better, more thoughtful metric is required, in my opinion, which better aligns costs with risks and assesses that risk against the backdrop of the entire swaps regulatory framework. The Commission is not establishing this de minimis threshold in a vacuum. Subsequent to the adoption of the swap dealer definition, other regulatory requirements have gone into effect which also advance the goals of swap dealer registration, like mandatory clearing, CEF trading, margin for uncleared swaps, and swap data and real-time reporting. Regardless of whether an entity is registered as a swap dealer, its swap activity is transparent to the Commission because swap transactions have been reported to swap data repositories. Any new metric must also be better aligned with the costs of swap dealer registration, and those costs have two primary components. There are risk-based costs, like capital and margin, and there are activity-based costs, like sending daily valuation reports to clients. The largest of those costs, though, are capital and margin requirements designed to mitigate systemic risk, which is a threat that entities hovering around the current $8 billion de minimis threshold likely do not pose. In addition, it's unclear that any entity engaging in swaps dealing activity around the $8 billion level has a sufficient number of transactions or counterparties such that their registration would have any appreciable impact on market transparency and counterparty protections. For these reasons, I believe the de minimis threshold should be based on metrics more closely correlated with risk as opposed to the current activity-based notional value metric. So examples of risk-based measures could include the amount of capital a firm holds against its swaps book, the economic exposure of a firm's swaps book, or some measure of a firm's uncleared swaps transactions. I look forward to exploring those or other risk-based metrics as we wait for new data and as we look at new data on the swaps market. However, if the Commission is intent on using only an activity-based metric to impose both risk-based and activity-based costs, it's my hope we can use the next few months to develop a much more robust measure of activity than notional value by itself. One idea would be to combine notional value with the number of a firm's dealing transactions and counterparties, creating a multi-pronged hurdle that a firm would have to exceed on all fronts. While each of those metrics has its own limitations in measuring actual dealing activity, a de minimis threshold that is comprised of several metrics would mitigate false positives from any one of the others. The de minimis exception can also be improved beyond just a threshold. Specifically, the agency should explore 3 recommendations: broadening the insured depository institution exclusion to align it with current lending practices, excluding swaps that are cleared, and treating all hedging swaps equally and as excluded from the threshold. So the insured depository institution, the IDI exclusion, allows for that institution to exclude swaps with customers that are connected to the origination of a loan from its de minimis count. Congress created that statutory exclusion to ensure that banks were not discouraged from assisting their borrowers in hedging risks associated with a loan, such as interest rate or currency risks. However, the Commission has implemented that statutory provision narrowly, and thus, in my view, imposed unnecessary restrictions that thwart the congressional intent behind the exclusion. I believe the current exclusion for IDI lending activity should be broadened to reflect the dynamic of borrowers' needs and demands. A loan isn't the only way that banks extend credit and shouldn't be the only exclusion. There are letters of credit, there are lines of credit, there are leases, there are revolving credit facilities, credit-enhanced bonds, and other forms of typical credit extension which should also be considered. Swaps tied to all of these different transactions should be excluded as part of a legitimate IDI lending activity. In addition, the IDI's exclusions time restrictions on hedging transactions to a very narrow window surrounding loan origination doesn't allow for hedging transactions, or around loan amendments or around refinancings, nor through the life of a borrowing transaction. That artificial time constraint that it must occur either or between 90 days before the loan agreement and up until 180 days after don't reflect the economic realities of how banks or firms serve their clients. In fact, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the OCC, expressed a similar view directly to the CFTC in its letter to our agency back in 2011 or 2012, stating that the IDI exclusion should be, quote, tailored to allow for ongoing hedging that is connected to an extension of credit, end quote, and that the statutory language of the IDI exclusion, quote, does not limit the loan exclusion to swaps that are connected to the financial terms of a loan, nor does it require that the swap be entered into contemporaneously with loan origination, end quote. A second way to improve the de minimis exemption revolves around cleared swaps. Currently, an entity must include cleared swaps in its de minimis calculation. However, central clearing addresses many of the systemic risk concerns that Dodd-Frank and swap dealer registration were designed to mitigate. Once a swap is cleared, the relationship between the counterparties is extinguished, and the clearinghouse manages the risks of the swap, including requiring the posting of margin. I don't see the regulatory necessity of requiring those swaps to count towards an entity's registration threshold. And lastly, the Commission should provide market participants with regulatory certainty regarding the exclusion for hedging activity. For example, it should be clear that a swap which hedges a dealing swap is not a dealing swap. That creates very perverse incentives. I believe hedging should be interpreted broadly to allow banks to continue to manage their own risks as opposed to being dictated by Washington how to do so. The de minimis exception is actually only one example of how the CFTC approached a one-size-fits-all approach that fails to identify, target, and regulate risk efficiently. In fact, you could have this conference every week for a number of months, and I could keynote it and wouldn't run out of examples. We could talk about no action letters. Since 2013, the CFTC has issued over 400 letters providing no action or exemptive relief for market participants, which is a direct indictment, in my view, of how many regulations had unrealistic compliance dates, adverse consequences, or that captured the wrong entities. But actually changing and modifying the underlying rules wasn't on the CFTC's list of things to do. Or we could talk about all the different determinations that an end user has to make to understand whether or not they're being captured by rules. And why do they have to do that? Because actually defining what a commercial end user is which is perhaps the most important term in Title VII of Dodd-Frank because the statute explicitly excludes them from many of the regulatory requirements. Defining that term wasn't on the CFTC's list of things to do. Or we could discuss the nauseating web of our cross-border policies, which if you actually visually diagram them, it looks like a Jackson Pollock painting. I'm serious. The Jackson Pollock approach to regulating international entities. We should be making it easier for market participants to understand the regulatory obligations, not harder. We should be promoting risk hedging and not discouraging it. We should be enhancing competition, not creating regulatory economies of scale. We should be striving for simplicity and targeted rulemaking, not one-size-fits-all mandates. The prior CFTC had their list, which was most notable for what wasn't included. This CFTC has our own list, and I believe it's most notable for what is. We're dedicating our thought and our energy into accomplishing good, meaningful, smart regulatory reform. I look forward to contributing to those and to sharing them with you in the near future. I appreciate your patience and your attention. Thank you so much to IFM and Mercatus for hosting me here tonight. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Commissioner Quintez for bringing his viewpoints and his energy and his fresh perspective to this event. Also would like to remind you to join us in the morning as we have our networking breakfast and followed by our program that will begin at 8:45. Please enjoy the rest of your evening with us, and thank you for coming.